Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and let's proceed with the second session of the Legal Day. I am very happy to introduce our next moderator, our very own Kadri Kaiska, who is the head of the law branch at the NATO CCD-COE. Please, Kadri, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Lena. And hello and welcome to the second session of the Law Day of the CyCon 2020 book launch. And I know I'm not by any means original in saying this, but I too regret not to be able to have you in Tallinn today. It's a lovely CyCon weather. Somebody turned the temperature on just for the right time, and here we are. The ways this has been an extraordinary spring are diverse and plentiful, and the cybersecurity community, not least, has been one that has experienced a surge in both the amount and the criticality of our work, while working like everybody else to keep our families and colleagues safe and sane. But it looks like the new quality and new value is always born out of the pain of crisis. So not only am I thrilled about the excellent content our speakers are about to present to you, and grateful indeed for their flexibility and their commitment to be part of this rather different CyCon, I'm also curious to be redefining CyCon and the cybersecurity conferencing, perhaps, together with such bright minds and the excellent team here in Tallinn. So in order of appearance, a warm welcome, Mr. Livinus Nweke, Mr. Neil Kushwaha, and Dr. Tina Park.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, and before we begin, some house rules. I will begin by introducing our speakers in order of appearance, and they will then each have 12 minutes to present their papers with perhaps a follow-on question from me. And then we will proceed to a joint Q&A session after the presentations. And to the viewers, you can see a chat button at the bottom right of your screen, of your browser screen. So please don't be shy using it and send in your questions to the speakers. We'll be happy to dive into discussions at the second half of the question. We welcome all of us to make this interactive. So our first speaker is Mr. Livinus Nweke, who will speak about some of the legal challenges around cyber threat information sharing by the private sector. Mr. Nweke is a PhD candidate at the Department of Information Security and Communication Technology at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. He has a Master of Science summa cum laude in Computer Science from the Sapienza Università di Roma in Italy, and he has worked with a next-generation firewall team in Cisco in Poland. And his research concerns, amongst other themes, critical infrastructure protection and software-defined networking. So, Mr. Nweke, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Hello, everyone. My name is Livinus. As you know, I'm with the Department of Information Security and Communication Technology at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, NTNU, Gjøvik, Norway. I'll be presenting my research article titled Legal Issues Related to Cyber Threat Information Sharing for Critical Infrastructure Protection, which was authored by Steven and myself. Let's look at the outline of the presentation. If you can switch the slide to the next. Okay, thank you. The outline of the presentation is as follows. First, I'll give a brief introduction where I describe the motivation for the article and its main focus. The basic steps of cyber threat information sharing, including the existing cyber threat information sharing architectures, benefits, and challenges will be presented. Then I will discuss the laws and regulations in the EU, Norway, and the US that are related to cyber threat information sharing. The outcome of the existing laws and regulations and the current trends in discussion among practitioners as it relates to cyber threat information sharing will be provided. And lastly, I will conclude the presentation and present future work. If we can go to the next slide. Thank you. In recent years, the cost of cyber incidents has been rising. This is clearly depicted by the report that is being shown here. As we can see from the report, the cost of cyber incidents has risen from about 17 million US dollars in 2001 to up to 2,700 in 2018. Also, against critical infrastructure expected to rise. For example, just this year March, it was reported that a ransomware attack was targeted at critical infrastructure belonging to a United States-based natural gas compression facility. Considering the complexity in the cyber threat landscape, organizations can no longer rely on internally generated cyber threat intelligence to protect themselves against this rising threats. Hence, cyber threat information sharing has been proposed as an effective and efficient way of improving the overall cyber intelligence and defense. So what we did in this article is to examine cyber threat information sharing in the context of private entities sharing cyber intelligence with each other. This is because private entities that wish to share cyber threat information have to consider if any information share contain materials that are potentially protected under data protection and privacy law, antitrust law, sort of negligence law, or intellectual property law. However, the focus for us in this article was to consider data protection and privacy law, as it has been cited as the greatest constraint for private entities willing to participate in cyber threat information sharing. So by reviewing the provisions of the laws and regulations support or refute the sharing of cyber threat information, we hope to provide guidance and incentive for private entities willing to participate in such sharing ventures, especially for critical infrastructure protection. So let's look at the background of this article. Cyber threat information sharing actually refers to information that can help an organization identify, assess, monitor, and respond to cyber threats. There are two kinds of cyber threat information sharing architectures that is usually deployed by private entities that participate in cyber threat information sharing. The first is the centralized architecture, where an organization is responsible for the exchange of cyber threat information between the participating entities. A typical example of the centralized architecture is what we have in the information sharing and analysis and sharing and analysis centers, the ISACs that we have around. So the second information sharing architecture is the peer-to-peer architecture, where private entities that are willing to participate in cyber threat information sharing do so directly without an intermediary. As we know, it's of cyber threat information sharing, but the one that deserves to be mentioned here is the fact that organizations that participate in cyber threat information sharing are able to obtain threat information, which ordinarily, without participating in such sharing venture, would not have access to. And also, they are able to exploit the collective knowledge, experience, and analytical capabilities of the participating entities. This and other benefits derived from participating in cyber threat information sharing. However, there are also challenges that private entities that are willing to participate in such will have to consider. One of those is establishing trust relationship. It's usually difficult, as we all know, to establish trust relationship between individuals. So when the efforts and the cost of establishing trust relationship could even dissuade private entities willing to participate in cyber threat information sharing. In addition, there's also a problem of interoperability and automation. Also, they have to also consider legal liabilities and the perceived risk to the organization's reputation, which could affect, which they fear would happen if they participate in such in cyber threat information sharing. So, regardless of the main goal for us in this article was to look at the legal liability, legal issues that are related to cyber threat information sharing for between private entities. So there are a number of laws that we considered. So let's look at these laws in the next slide. So the laws we considered are the laws in the EU, Norway, and the US, because those in the EU and US are models for such laws and regulations in many jurisdictions around the world. So what we considered, the laws we considered, we examined in the EU for this particular article. The first one is the Directive 2016, Directive 2016 of July 2016, also known as the Network and Information System Directive. This is the first EU-wide cybersecurity legislation, which is aimed to enhance cybersecurity across the EU critical infrastructure. Also, we also looked at the popular GDPR, which, as we know, has been hailed as the model for data protection and privacy law in both EU and beyond, and the EU Cybersecurity Act, which provides permanent mandate for EU agency for cybersecurity. So for Norway, what we did was to look at the Norwegian National Security Act, also known as the Security Act. It is mainly concerned with the security-related information system and objects, or infrastructure essential for basic national functions, which are the critical infrastructures. And in the US, we considered the Cyber Security Information Sharing Act, which is regarded to be the most significant cyber-related legislation. So these are the laws we reviewed in the article, right? And from our review, we're able to have some insight into what the outcomes of this review. And these outcomes will be described in the discussion forum in the next slide. In general, the survey of the existing laws and regulations, in addition with the current discussions among practitioners, indicate that cyber threat information sharing may be lawful. So private entities that intend to participate in sharing, in such sharing venture, should just take care that the information they share does not contain information that are protected by data protection and privacy laws. However, when the processing of personal data is necessary, several authors argue that legitimate interests of data controller under Article 6(1)(f) of the GDPR can be used as a legal basis. So to conclude this presentation, there is no doubt that cyber threat information sharing increases the overall cyber intelligence and defense. So what we have done in this article is to look at the laws, existing laws in the EU, Norway, and the US that are related to cyber threat information sharing, to be able to understand the provisions that could support or could refute the sharing of cyber threat information, to provide guidance for private entities that are willing to participate in such sharing ventures. So our study indicates that processing of cyber threat information and subsequent sharing with others in a bid to protect network infrastructure and improve overall cyber intelligence and defense can be considered legitimate interest under GDPR for processing of any personal data that may be found in cyber threat information. For future work, it will be interesting to consider approaches that organizations may employ to automate cyber threat information sharing and still conform with the existing laws and regulations. So details of this article, for details of the article, you could take a look at the publication on the site, so you could see all the results and the descriptions of the surveys that was conducted as part of the study for this article. So thank you so much for listening, and you're welcome to ask me any question going forward. I'll be glad to respond to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Livinus. I think I have a reflection and a question to you. What I really appreciated about your paper is your very pragmatic take of demystifying the subject of personal data protection and privacy for incident responders. It may not be the world's most sort of academically complex question, but the prevalence of those worries about the impact of GDPR upon the threat, the cyber incident response and prevention is something that sort of, if you look at the aggregate impact, it does really affect our cybersecurity capacity. So I know that in your article you also had briefly examined the other legal risks that apply. So in comparison, or if you take this sort of sum total of your insight of the legal risks for the threat information sharing, how prevalent or how weighty do you see the concern of breaching GDPR and privacy regulations to be for service providers today?
Yeah, the issue here is that there were a bit of discrepancy in what is considered private information when it comes to cyber threat information sharing. For instance, some of the technical information that is shared as part of threat intelligence, some like there was a court ruling in Germany that considered IP address as personal information, but there are also rulings that said no, IP address is personal information. Now, if IP address is considered as a personal information, it becomes a bigger concern for service providers. But if it is not considered personal information, then it's no longer much of a big concern. So, but there are also additional cyber threat informations like contextual information, like contextual awareness, that are likely, usually they are most likely to contain personal information. But the sharing of such information are not really prevalent in cyber threat information sharing schemes. So for me, it depends on if the IP address, which is one of the major part of the cyber threat information, is considered a personal information or not. That would determine if the service providers should worry so much about the GDPR.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for your response. So next up we have Mr. Neil Kushwaha presenting his article on government data sovereignty in the cloud, written jointly with a speaker in our previous session, Przemysław Roguski and Bruce Watson. And Neil's list of accomplishments is an inspiring read in its own right. He's the recipient of the 2019 Royal Medal of Bravery Award, which I understand is connected to his long-time passion of mountaineering. Then moreover, he's a motivational speaker, guest lecturer at Stellenbosch University, and the founder of Impendo, a Canadian public sector-oriented consulting company. And his work falls at the intersection of cyberspace, security, and law, and he has published on a broad range of subjects connected to these topics. And aligned with his PhD research, he supports nations with their cyber programs. So, Mr. Kushwaha, take it away.
Thank you very much. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to all, and thank you for joining. First, I must recognize the great partnership of my colleagues, as previously stated here, Dr. Roguski and Dr. Watson, for their invaluable contribution to the paper. I'd also be amiss if I didn't thank the CCD COE CyCon team, the peer reviewers, the audiovisual team, and many more for their hard work in making everything we're experiencing yesterday, today, and tomorrow a success. I'm missing Talon, a little bit nostalgic with the lanyard here, the enthusiasm among the delegates and the hospitality. I really hope to reconvene in person next year. So let's get this started. I'm just throwing this up here to kick off a discussion on sovereignty for those of you who aren't familiar. So that's why I threw that up there on the first slide. So last year at CyCon 2019, Mike Schmidt discussed how certain breaches of sovereignty via cyber means may not be as clear compared to of violation of territorial integrity and inherently governmental functions. Although the UNGG consensus confirming that sovereignty applies to the conduct of states of ICT-related activities and jurisdiction over ICT infrastructure within their territory, what about the data stored within that ICT infrastructure? And what if the data happens to be stored on ICT infrastructure in another territory? So let's consider this scenario here. And I'm going to, again, read from the slide because it's going to be on screen, so please forgive me for that. So let's jump right into this. A governmental department in state A extends a contract to a cloud service provider headquartered in state B. State A department consumes various cloud services, storing transactional data like emails, calendars, etc., and master data like names, address, social insurance numbers, and income in the CSP's data centers located in state A and replicated in other data centers under the CSP's control, specifically in state B. Consider further that state B may authorize its law enforcement agencies to access all data stored by CSPs registered in state B and oblige those CSPs to preserve and hand over the data on production of warrant. Alternatively, let's say the data in state B's data center is breached by foreign non-state actors and copied to data centers located in state C. The non-state actors then publicly share the content from state C data centers for anyone to consume, exposing conversations, contacts, and state A citizen data, risking identity theft, cybercrimes, and more. In both examples, state A loses control over its data, at the same time enabling another sovereign, especially in variant 2A, to exercise control over that data by virtue of being stored in that state's territory. Our article explores the concept of data sovereignty and asks whether unconsented access to government data stored abroad would constitute a violation of a state's sovereignty, and what states can do to ensure continued control over their data. So if you start with one, technological sovereignty, and then to the slightly narrower term of digital sovereignty, we come to data sovereignty. Given that territoriality loses its importance with respect to data in cyberspace, the main aspect of data sovereignty becomes the exclusive authority of or control With respect to criminal proceedings, the US Cloud Act and EU proposal make it easier to quickly request and gather electronic evidence. However, this places a burden on CSPs. Being prepared to respond to potential 6-hour or 10-day response for a production order likely means CSPs will invest in resources to help manage these quick turnaround requests. And by that, these investments are unlikely to be in each nation in which it operates, and will probably be in a central location, at least for the smaller CSPs. Due to the volume and velocity of the log data, CSPs looking to remain in good standing with their respective governments and laws may consider keeping active copies of their customers' metadata, possibly their customers' data, in their headquartered country for easy centralized parsing. This duplication of data into CSP in another country may result in a breach of sovereignty, while constant parsing of customer data and metadata may be considered a breach of privacy. Our paper performs a high-level evaluation of the US-UK executive agreement, along with France, Germany, and Poland's position. So starting with the US-UK agreement, we have some observations and noted some limitations. Under the agreement, US law enforcement is not obligated to notify third parties requesting their data from the UK. 2, the US and UK can request data of persons in another country, creating conflicts with other laws. And 3, the agreement does not address governmental data or government employee data. The agreement governs only production orders for data of individuals that is needed to combat serious crimes, not industrial or government data. Neither does it give the UK government a way to address potential production orders for governmental data by American law. So be it under the Cloud Act or provisions of other domestic law, actually. So the issue remains unresolved by the agreement. In 2019, the French Senate convened an inquiry on the topic of digital sovereignty. In its final report presented by Rapporteur Monsieur Gérard Longuet, they examined the question of cloud storage and extraterritorial jurisdiction. It found that 1, data localization rules might be important with respect to securing digital sovereignty, and 2, data stored with US headquartered CSPs in France data centers do not reduce the risk posed by US Cloud Act. And 3, it criticized the Cloud Act as being too broad regarding and the infractions covered and the type and amount of data collected. It also found the Cloud Act to pose a risk of access by American law enforcement to strategic data of legal persons and to be incompatible with the GDPR's protection of personal data. Finally, 4, the report suggests several mitigations, and for this presentation, we singled out one seen on screen. It's clear the report suggests that France is concerned about US and Chinese extraterritorial reach brought on by their dominance in the software and hardware sectors, respectively. We believe they must take, or pardon me, they believe, based on our paper, we believe as well, they must take robust action to protect French data and strategic interests from foreign states, including the US. Moving on to Germany, much like France, Germany is also deeply concerned of their digital sovereignty, specifically with respect to US CSPs. The German government has repeatedly stressed any solution needs to respect the fundamental human rights and facilitate cooperation between states. Germany has taken some key actions to put themselves in a better position. 1, they have limited the type of data that can be stored on US cloud services. This first action is driven not only by the government, but by regional data protection agencies. For example, the Hessian Commissioner for Data Protection and Freedom of Information has forbidden schools in the land of Hesse to use Microsoft Office 365 services or to store students' personal data in the cloud if the providers are subject to US law. They're developing, and second, they're developing an autonomous solution. Germany's kicked off Project Gaia X, CSP's capability from within Europe. Now let's move on to Poland. Poland has taken on two key actions: the launch of a national cloud with Google for the private sector, and two, planning of a gov cloud for the public sector. Recently, Microsoft has also agreed to invest in a national cloud within Poland. It remains to be seen whether Poland will exclude foreign cloud service providers from their governmental computational cloud, or try to secure governmental data contracts and through encryption, possibly securing through encryption. So Poland cannot rely on big national CSPs, and therefore is dependent on outside expertise for its national cloud, and thus limited in its potential quest for digital sovereignty. So to conclude, but not conclude, hence up in the air, we can see that there is no one universal way in which states try to ensure their data sovereignty against the challenge posed by the US Cloud Act and the potential long-arm jurisdiction over data stored with US CSPs. The reactions range from data localization laws such as Russia or China, to treaty-based cooperation with the US, such as US-UK agreement, to Poland's contract-based cooperation with the US CSPs using software solutions while building localized data clusters, to France escaping from US long-arm jurisdiction by legislative decoupling, and to Germany complete technological independence. All these examples show that states recognize the need to ensure data sovereignty and limit its exposure to the control and access by the US. In our view, the concerns raised by France and Germany over their data sovereignty are not confined to those states, but describe a universal challenge of the principle of sovereignty in cyberspace. States increasingly face difficult policy decisions with regards to deciding how best to balance competing sovereign interests. Based on this, our paper proposes 7 actions for consideration by states that have not yet specifically addressed the data sovereignty issues discussed in this paper. Actions A, B, C, and D are likely to be completed sequentially, followed by actions E, F, and G, which could be executed concurrently. Of course, all of these recommendations involve speculation from us, the authors, and will require further debate. Thank you very much for participating and joining virtually to hear about our paper, and thank you once again to the entire CyCon 2020 team.
And thank you very much, Neil. For me, the points you raised trigger somewhat philosophical or existential questions on, or thoughts on monopolies and monocultures. Do you think a more diverse cloud ecosystem would not only, like you rightly pointed out in your last bullet of your last slide, sort of strengthen the sovereign position, but could it also curb the power concentration to single jurisdictions and the appeal to overexert jurisdiction by those regions? I would assume or imagine that it would introduce more regional perspective and regional voice, but also regional competence into this discussion.
You raise a good point there. It's not something particularly studied, but for sure it raises concern and potential limitations of space, like pockets of internet, if you would call it, or pockets of access. And we're really curious to see how states react to this. I'm curious to see how Canada reacts to this personally. Looking at how the protection of Germany, for example, in their side, and how they've reacted, it sort of does create a space of their own. But I think it's a somewhat welcomed idea of creating a sense of sovereignty for the data side. I am quite concerned about data stored in the cloud and how other nations may or may not have access to that, and especially governments making use of such cloud capacities, making it much more complex. So curious to see how nations react as well.
I would be intrigued to, yes, I would be intrigued to carry on this conversation, but I don't want to be stealing away time from our next speaker. So thank you very much again, Neil. I hope we will have more time for questions. I see that coming from the audience as well. So finally and importantly, Dr. Tina Park, who is a co-founder and executive director of the Canadian Centre for the Responsibility to Protect, based at the University of Toronto. She is furthermore the vice president of the NATO Association of Canada and a former fellow at the NATO Defense College in Rome. She's a globally renowned expert on North Korea's nuclear weapons program and has advised over 30 governments and international organizations on their human rights policies. And she furthermore often serves as a media commentator for CBC, BBC, CTV, and Al Jazeera. So she is indeed bringing a broad perspective to this discussion. Dr. Park will present her paper about the responsibility to protect and cyberspace, sovereignty as a responsibility, co-authored with her colleague, Michael Switzer. So Dr. Park, you're very welcome to take the floor. I think we need you to unmute your microphone. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Katri, for that kind introduction. I'd like to begin by welcoming you all for this virtual conversation, and also our colleagues at the Center of Excellence in Tallinn who have worked so hard to put this virtual book launch together. Next slide, please. So our presentation today will be divided into 4 key parts. I'll begin by explaining what is R2P, responsibility to protect, and move on to the framework of analysis that we've used for this particular chapter, and discuss some intersections between R2P and the cyber domain, and make some suggestions moving forward. So what is R2P, you may wonder? Responsibility to protect is a humanitarian principle coined in 2001, actually under the leadership of the Canadian government. And this board, International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, produced a massive report that you see on screen called the Responsibility to Protect. It was then revised and later adopted by 150 countries at the 2005 UN World Summit. And essentially, R2P states that when sovereign states are unable or unwilling to fulfill their responsibility to protect their own populations from mass atrocity crimes, the international community has a responsibility to do so. So to give you a very easy examples to relate to would be an incident like the Rwandan genocide or the Holocaust, where the international community literally just became bystanders to awful crimes that were being committed in different countries. So R2P really comes out of that historical context in the post-Cold War era and the outbreak of new conflicts that we saw in the 1990s. And around that time, humanitarian intervention became a new buzzword for the international community. Yet there were controversies when it took place. We saw, for instance, in Somalia, Bosnia, and Kosovo, where there were different sorts of issues about intervention. And then when it failed to take place, namely Rwanda. And the problem became the militarization of interventions using UN peacekeeping troops, as well as the issue of selectivity. You know, when do you decide to go into a conflict abroad? Next slide, please. And why is R2P so significant? It's absolutely significant because it marks an incredible shift, both normatively and conceptually, from the Westphalian notion of absolute sovereignty into sovereignty as a responsibility. And the version that was adopted in 2005 was limited to 4 specific crimes, namely genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. It is absolutely important for us to recognize that R2P is very clearly limited to these 4 crimes, because in the earlier stage, there were concerns about things like natural disaster. You know, if country X has any climate change related issues, for instance, should we intervene? And under the frame of R2P, the answer is no. There's also a conceptual focus on populations and the responsibility of the state. We recognize individuals as the main recipients of this R2P doctrine, and there is a very strong emphasis on prevention. So often when you hear about R2P in the media, it's about military intervention like we saw in Libya. But the answer is actually that is the last resort, and we always want to focus on the prevention pillar of R2P. And the R2P, as it was enacted in 2005, was very important because it marked such a widespread consensus within the international community to recognize that sovereignty is not absolute and that with sovereignty comes a certain set of responsibilities. Next slide, please. And what have we done with R2P at the UN level since then? Well, the UN has created a special office along with the UN Office on the Prevention of Genocide, an R2P advisor at the UN level to continue the dialogue. And the UN, former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon started issuing reports, which I had the honor of contributing. And every year there was a report on how we can implement R2P in our national governments and in regional and international organizations, and the implementation of it became the sort of main focus of the R2P community. And a key takeaway from this development is the three-pillar approach that Ban Ki-moon came up with when it comes to implementing R2P. Next slide, please. R2P has three key pillars. The first one is the state's responsibility to protect populations, and second one on assisting states in capacity building, and pillar 3 on international communities' responsibility to use various tools and take collective action. It's very important to recognize that these pillars are to be applied simultaneously as needed rather than in any sort of sequence. Next slide. And now we turn to some of the real-life cases of R2P. In 2007, there was a crisis which broke out in Kenya. And at the time, Kofi Annan led a diplomatic mission to resolve this crisis with the participation of the private sector. And this has become one of the success stories of R2P because it marked a very important occasion where the public sector and private sector effectively prevented the crisis from getting out of control. And it also showed the power of diplomacy. Next slide. Yet the success stories didn't last very long because we also had a case like the Libyan intervention back in 2011, where the UN Security Council agreed to intervene in with the R2P language in Libya, but it was very controversial at the end because of the regime change involving Gaddafi. So after Libya, a lot of questions, of course, came out on the selective nature of intervention and what do you do or how do you exit after intervening in a crisis. Next slide. There's also the case of R2P in Syria. When we look at what's been happening in Syria, it's absolutely appalling what we've seen since 2011. Over 500,000 people have been killed and some 11.8 million people have become refugees or internally displaced people. Yet we continue to see a deadlock at the Security Council level with the P5, and in the sort of aftermath of Libya, we are always worried about unintended consequences of intervention and really the geopolitical interests that often overshadow humanitarian needs. Next slide. In Syria, we see all sorts of crimes being committed that are illegal and banned under international law, and that includes crimes against humanity being committed against civilians, as well as the use of cluster bombs, chemical and biological weapons, and really women and children who are the targets of these conflicts, as well as incredible millions and millions of people as refugees and IDPs. And what's been happening in Syria really shocks our conscience when we look at the existing tenets of law under international humanitarian law, human rights law, international criminal law, as well as just the universal values of human rights that we believe in. Next slide. So where are we today with R2P? There are a lot of controversies surrounding the Libyan intervention, even to this day, and the UN is now focusing on prevention and using early warning mechanisms and technology, if we could, to prevent crisis from breaking out. Next slide. So that's where our discussion really begins. And on screen, you see a photo from the Rohingya and the crisis we're seeing in Myanmar. Next slide. Where Facebook was used to incite hate against the vulnerable population. So our central premise here is that mass atrocity crimes do not happen overnight, and we can build capacities to prevent and respond more effectively. And as the case of Facebook and Myanmar demonstrates, we do have such potential in the cyber domain, and our central question then becomes, how can we use technology to prevent and respond to R2P crimes? And our framework of analysis really derives from the UN's framework of analysis for preventing mass atrocity crimes. So through our book chapter, we explored how cyber domain relates to R2P in terms of challenges and opportunities, and how can we implement it. And cyber domain is analyzed into three broad categories for our analysis. Next slide. And broadly speaking, we group them together based on their intended effect rather than particular technologies. So the first category is the cyber material sabotage, which enables an actor to damage another's capacity to function. Then cyber information collector and manipulation. So this enables an actor to obtain and manipulate information about population or agency or even an institution, but in a way that may not cause immediate material damage. The last category is cyber social influence, which enables an actor to alter the perceptions, beliefs, and decision-making of a given population. Next slide. Let's move on. So our first category is cyber material sabotage. And here we see that cyber terror attacks on infrastructure, for instance, by North Korean hackers, could cause a lot of damage to our banking institutions and our infrastructure, which weakens the resilience and strength of a society, and which could then trigger some atrocity crimes. We're also very much aware that the hackers in North Korea have generated billions of dollars through hacking banks in the Western world, for instance, which are then used to really fund their own activities. So where does the opportunity lie here? Although it is not possible to attack states as actors, we could certainly use the technology to disrupt activities of non-state actors who are committing these crimes. Then we get to cyber information collection and manipulation capabilities, where there are key challenges arising from surveillance capabilities, which allows actors to track and target populations. So think of the Chinese government, for instance, who collect data on personal details of an individual, you know, how tall is this person, where does he shop, what kind of car does he drive, where does he go frequently in his neighborhood. So this kind of information could then be used against this particular person, especially if he's somebody who is voicing opposition against the regime. There's also the issue of censorship, which allows authoritarian regimes, for instance, to hide some of their crimes. And a case in point, for instance, could be North Korea. Next slide. Yet, there are also opportunities because we could call upon the states to be more accountable, and we could also ask for help from different private sector companies involved in these surveillances to use and really adopt better corporate social responsibility. We also know that there are excellent civil society organizations who are monitoring these issues and who are willing to cooperate and collaborate with the citizens. And lastly, we could also engage in quantitative analysis of atrocity crime risks and ensure that whatever the risk factors are present in the society, we are notified and have a mechanism for coordinating our response. Next slide. Lastly, we know that social influence is really the hotspot of our interest because Facebook and Twitter and even Instagram are now being used to undermine credibility of institutions, incite hate, and recruit for the purposes of committing mass atrocity crimes. And this incitement of hatred is something that could be easily prevented from the corporate level if we are to collaborate more actively with actors like Facebook. Next slide. So where do we go from here? We could certainly engage in opportunities when it comes to hate speech censorship and countering hate when we see that online, because for too long we have just generally ignored what's happening in the cyber domain when it comes to advocating human rights and really exercising our collective responsibility. So we're calling for more careful attention on this particular issue and really channeling our energy to stop incitement of hate online. Next slide. So our key conclusions are as follows. First of all, we argue that it is absolutely critical to mainstream R2P into the cyber domain or look for the issues of convergence where human rights and the cyber domain could intersect and really move forward in mainstreaming some of the issues and challenges that we've seen when we discuss R2P. Second is investing in public-private partnership. Because a lot of these platforms are owned by the private sector, it's absolutely critical for national governments and regional and international organizations to collaborate with the private sector in countering hate messages. Lastly, we also recognize the ongoing artificial intelligence revolution and the need to use AI technology for finding innovative solutions. Before we know it, we will soon have robots and others assisting us in countering such hate crimes online and ensuring that we retain our own privacy and freedom while also adhering to a certain set of guidelines for activities in the cyber domain. So in conclusion, I would once again like to thank our colleagues at the Center of Excellence and encourage you to get in touch if you have any ideas and suggestions you'd like to share. And I look forward to your questions. Thanks so much for listening.
Thanks so much for your thoughtful elaboration, Tina. I've visited the Rwanda Genocide Memorial in Kigali twice, actually, and it struck me how extensively and how purposefully the communications technology of the day was used in inciting the violence and also carrying out the atrocities. So the use of communications technologies as a tool in conducting mass atrocity crime is not a new development in itself. But it looks like it has made an amplification by cyberspace. Do you think it could also become an amplification of the tools to prevent if we as states and industries are willing to probe the complex, inconvenient questions? How much do you actually see that happening, if at all?
I think it could go either way, to be honest, Katri, because as much as we are concerned about intrusion of privacy and state controlling our activities online, the fact of the matter is, as we speak right now, no matter where you are, there's a greater potential for misuse and abuses of technology in the cyber domain. And when you look at Rwanda, what happened over a mere course of 100 days when 800,000 people were killed, and the most critical element there was radio transmissions advising people where to go and how to feel, the same kind of procedures and mechanisms now exist through Facebook and Twitter and other online channels. So all that we are saying is that, yes, we are aware of the very fine line between individual privacy and freedom of expression and state intervention in the cyber domain. But when it comes to the four universally recognized mass atrocity crimes, such as genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, really the types of crimes that would appall our conscience, then I'm advocating for some sort of mechanism and a coordinated response where we could shut that down, as we saw in Myanmar or even in the Philippines, where hate message and incitement of hate was just rampant, and we didn't take any action to stop it on time.
Well, thank you again for your presentation, and thank you all of you for your presentations and your papers. We do have some questions from the audience, and I'm first turning to Livinus. The question is, first of all, thanking you for your excellent presentation. And the question is, do you think that the approach to GDPR will change because of the COVID-19?
Oh, thank you very much for the question. Actually, we can see that happening, not just because now, for example, here in Norway, people there was a new application that was people were asked to install on their system, on their phones, on their mobile devices, to be able to track where they are, to enable them when if you come in contact with someone that has been infected, then you can be notified and all that. This is already privacy violation. But you can see that unprecedented, but you would be able to appreciate the fact that an unprecedented times calls for unprecedented measures. So GDPR has actually been affected by the pandemic, and we could see some of these regulations would have to be changed because it was not actually there was no thoughts like considerations for situations like this, right? But the situations like this have also caused for maybe changes and modifications that needs to be considered when processing personal information. And I agree with the I agree with the person that asked the question there. Yeah, it would actually change the views on GDPR.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So there's a question for Neil regarding whether it makes sense at this point for Canada to invest in her own sovereign cloud services as a means of physical safety net that technology can provide. So what's your take on this?
That's a dangerous question for a Canadian to answer. I'm not here to answer on behalf of the Crown, but it is a wonderful question. In the sense that should they or shouldn't they, and what would be those impacts? Cultivating sovereign CSPs isn't something that I'm opposed to. I think it's a fantastic idea. It's just whether we can time frame some of the costs that are implications or cost implications of that. It's not just a technological question or a legal question, it's also a political question there. And those three spheres have to be considered, much like the three sort of the Russian dolls we discussed earlier. So do I think they should? I certainly think it's a great consideration for investment in Canada in itself, much like what Germany is doing with the Gaia X, and I hope that maybe it is considered.
All right, thanks very much. And Tina, I'm finally turning to you with a question of whether the merely reactive or state assisting role of the private sector, as set out in the UN World Summit outcome, whether that is sufficient today, given the global weight of today's, even the big five or the big tech players or the GAFAM, and their insight into the developments, which is probably superior to that of the states today. Do you think the role of the private sector increase? Should it? What's your perspective?
That's an excellent question, Kadri, and I am so glad that somebody brought this up because today we are certainly seeing limitations of relying upon state as the main actor for preventing and responding to mass atrocity crimes, especially when we see a certain deadlock at the P5 level at the UN Security Council. And even if the UN Security Council were to agree upon intervention, it's very unclear who is funding certain activities, who is taking leadership, and how do we exit gracefully after intervention, and who really decides and calls the shot when there is a crisis happening elsewhere in the world. And I do believe that the way we could break through this kind of deadlock that we're seeing at the international level is to really empower individuals and private sector actors, as well as civil society and others, to ensure that our pledge of never again and our pledge of upholding collective responsibility to protect people who cannot speak for themselves is really enshrined in everything we do at the international level. I think time has come for us to really turn to the tools offered in the cyber domain, and also recognize that individuals too can make a difference. And you know, you think of journalists who are shooting a mass atrocity crisis in Africa. You think of individuals reporting about it somewhere in Asia. You also think of how much impact private sector organizations like Microsoft and Facebook could have when states are unwilling to intervene. So I think what we do need is certainly a political commitment to the R2P principle, because it does mark such a breakthrough when it comes to sovereignty as responsibility. But at the same time, we do have to remember that we can't just rely on states to fix all these crises. And in fact, the responsibility falls upon all of us to ensure that the values that are so dear to NATO and its allies and partners are upheld, and that we actually put resources to ensure that our values continue to remain relevant in our future.
Thank you all again. Thank you, Tina, for your response, and thank you all our presenters and panelists for your outstanding papers and presentations. It has been a pleasure to spend a piece of the afternoon with you. All the very best, and I hope to see you in Tallinn next year. And thank you to the audience for your thoughtful questions. Thank you for staying with us for the second session of the Law Day of CyCon, and we are looking forward to seeing you tomorrow for the Tech Day. And over to you, the hosts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kadri, for moderating the session and for leading the discussions. Also, thanks to our panelists for their very interesting presentations. And finally, to you, the audience, for joining us today. This rounds up the second day of the virtual book launch of the 2020 CyCon proceedings.
We hope to see you again tomorrow at 1600 Eastern European time. For the third and final day, as mentioned, focusing on the technology articles of the proceedings. So have a great day or evening, and see you again very soon.